This is Austin Smallwood, your SCR Director of Legal and Regulatory Affairs, to go over the upcoming changes to SCR Form 330. This is the general lots and acreage form, but this form can also be used for a boat slip or a similar transaction. Most of the changes in this form are going to look very similar to you, as we mostly took the changes that were made to the residential contracts form, SCR Forms 300 and 310 in 2020, and updated those to be in this form. So most of these changes should look similar to you, but the key was to try to make the two forms, even though this is for lots and acreage, to make it as similar to the residential form as possible, understanding that there are some key differences. So the first changes were just like in the other residential forms, the disclaimer that they should be getting every party should be getting legal advice. We moved that to the very top of the contract. We also removed business days. So just like the new residential contracts, business days will not be a part of this contract. It will either be a hard date or calendar days. There will no longer be business days in SCR Form 330. We added that checkbox about the making sure that the buyer and seller acknowledge that they've received the disclosure of brokerage relationship form and whether or not they're receiving client or customer status. Reminder that that form needs to be given at the point of first substantive contact. So as soon as you start talking to someone about real estate, make sure that they are getting that form and that you also have given them, send it to them via email as well. Make sure that you sort of have a paper trail that they've received it, but they will acknowledge receipt of that form here on the contract. Just like we did for the residential contract, we got rid of the automatic extension for closing date. So now if the closing date needs to change, the parties are going to need to agree to that through a pen and ink change or by copying this first sentence into a separate addendum. There will be no more automatic extension because there was so much dispute of whether it applied or not and whose fault was it. It was a real unsatisfied contingency, so the parties are now going to have to agree on changing a closing date. We also are going to make sure that since this is land, we clean this up a little bit to say that, hey, you're going to give us a vacant property free of debris, and then also the seller is going to remove all man-made items from the property unless otherwise agreed upon in writing by the party. So if there's something that, a shed or a tractor or something like that that wants to be left, then you guys need to negotiate for that separately, but otherwise everything needs to be taken from that property. The earnest money section, this is to match up with the changes that were made to the residential form. So now earnest money will either be accompanying the offer or due by 6 p.m. on a hard date. Make sure that the parties are aware of that date. If you're negotiating back and forth, make sure that that date still makes sense, that you're not boxing yourself in by giving your client an hour or two to try to do that. If the earnest money is not delivered by the agreed upon date above, then the seller can terminate the contract by delivering notice of termination to the buyer. So make sure as a buyer that you're getting that in by 6 p.m. on that hard date. Transaction costs, this is the exact verbiage that we have from the residential form. List out what the buyer costs are, what the seller costs are. We did move up the language about special assessments up from the adjustment paragraph up to here. We get a lot of questions about special assessments. So this is not new language. This is just language that we've moved to give it a more prominent position in the form. Pretty simple. Special assessments that are approved prior to closing are the responsibility of the seller. Those approved after closing are those of the buyer. Again, for transaction costs, just like we did for the residential form, we no longer have a dollar amount or a percentage. It is just going to be a dollar amount. So one less calculation that you have to do and reduces some error. Financing, just like the residential form, there's no longer a minimum maximum. It's just going to be a maximum percentage. We're going to require that the seller apply for financing by a hard date, and they give you a pre-final loan approval by a hard date. If the buyer changes their lender during the financing period, they have to notify you within so many calendar days. But absent approval by the seller, the buyer cannot change their lender if the closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 will change as a direct result. So if you're going to, one party cannot take an action to change the closing date. So if you're going to change lenders and as a result the closing date is going to change, you're going to need the seller to sign off on the change of that closing date. Inspections, we do just like we do in the residential form. Give the seller, the seller's going to grant the buyer the right to a final walkthrough within 48 hours of the closing date. Appraised value, we just changed that from business days to calendar days. Otherwise, that is the exact same verbiage as before. Due diligence, Being a land contract, there aren't the 3 repair options like there are in the repair. This is simply a due diligence contract. So what we did is we matched up this language to be the exact due diligence language from the residential form. So again, make sure that your buyer is doing everything within their due diligence period and they're giving the seller adequate time to respond, because that is a hard date. So 6 p.m. on a hard date, this entire due diligence process needs to be done. Any contingencies that are separate from this will not be included in the due diligence. If there's a separate contingency, it will stand on its own, but everything in the due diligence needs to be done during the due diligence period. And again, if there's a termination fee, make sure that you are paying the termination fee and delivering that notice of termination using SCR Form 313 by that deadline. Fire and casualty, we expanded that from 5 days to 14 days. We've seen on the hotline the past few years with the number of storms and things of that sort, because of evacuations or maybe just because the damage hasn't been cleared. Sometimes it's impossible to even get to your property within 5 days. So we've expanded that from 5 days to 14 calendar days. Building permit rezoning, those were changed to calendar days from business days, and we removed all the contractual disbursement of earnest money language from the contract, as earnest money per real estate commission rulings must be dispersed through mutual agreement of parties or a court order. Paragraph 16, we added this in. This is the same verbiage that is in SCR Form 391 regarding deed restrictions, but we added this to the form there. So if you have any questions about that, give us a call on the hotline. Septic, same as before with the other permits, calendar days, and got rid of the contractual disbursement of earnest money form language. Soil and water issues, we added that from Form 391, so that is not new verbiage, but it is new verbiage to this form, but is not new verbiage to the SCR Forms library. Rollback taxes, this is some new language here. Essentially, the 2 options would be that the seller is going to pay them, the buyer is going to pay them, or they're going to do a split. Make sure you're only, of course, checking one of the following options, but you do essentially have 3 options here in rollback taxes. Here we just essentially changed everything from 26 from business days to calendar days, and again got rid of that earnest money disbursement language. Adjustments, the only change we made there is we got rid of that special assessments language from adjustments, but again we moved that up to paragraph 6, transaction costs, so it is still in there. We just moved it to a more prominent position. Attachments, we got rid of some attachments that no longer either are SCR forms that no longer exist, or they're not relevant for vacant land. We added the only to the notice language to remind you again that notice is only effective if it's actually delivered to the notice address, email, fax that is on the contract. So make sure when you are sending notice to someone that you're actually giving it to the proper address, email, fax that is on this contract. Expiration of offer, again, please put an expiration of offer in your contract, but make sure also that it makes sense. Don't try to box somebody in and then end up with a dead contract before parties can even look at it. But if you do fail to put in an expiration of offer, this offer will automatically expire within 30 calendar days after submittal if no action is taken by any party. That's a rejection, an acceptance, or a counter. Essentially, if it just goes in a desk drawer for 30 days after you receive it, it's going to be automatically expired. We again put in 4 buyer lines, 4 seller lines. This is that notice, address, email, fax that we mentioned for doing notice. Make sure you're sending it to the proper place. And in lieu of the old page that made you put a bunch of information in there, they're now just going to be the lines very much similar to the residential form for buyer's agent and seller's agent, company, license number, email address, telephone number. Those may be different than the notice, address, email, fax. Make sure if you're sending notices that those are going to that particular address, email, or fax. That is not most likely going to be the buyer or the seller's address, email, fax. That is most likely going to be your office. It's going to be where does your buyer want to be notified of any contract addendums, due diligence things of that sort. So make sure that you are clarifying that with your client. So those are the changes to SCR Form 330. Like I said, they're very similar to the changes that were made to the residential form last year. But if you have any questions on this form or any other form in the SCR Forms library, please give us a call on the legal hotline, 803-772-5206. Thank you.